This video will review how to draw and label the normal model. So for this example, the Virginia Cooperative Extensions reports that the mean weight of yearling Angus steers is 1,152 pounds. Suppose that weights of all such animals can be described by a normal model. I'm going to stress here, it does mention that it's normal, with a standard deviation of 84 pounds. Draw the normal model, label the mean and number of standard deviations, then identify the value of the mean and each standard deviation. So to start off, we need to draw the normal model. I just found a copy of this online. Notice it's a blank normal curve. The normal curve is a bell shape. So we need to start off here labeling the mean and the number of standard deviations. The mean is the value that is always right in the middle, that is at the highest peak. Normally we label the mean with an X bar. X bar is the symbol for mean. Again, that's always right smack dab in the middle at the highest point of the bell curve. As we go out from the bell curve, we move standard deviations away. If we're moving to the right of the mean, that's a positive standard deviation. If we're moving to the left of the mean, that's a negative standard deviation. So if we start at the mean and we move to the right, we are at 1 standard deviation. If we move to the right of 1 standard deviation, we're going to be at 2 standard deviations. And if we move to the right of 2 standard deviations, we will be at 3 standard deviations. It's going to be very similar on the other side of the mean. So if we're at the mean and we move to the left 1, we're going to be at negative 1 standard deviations. If we move to the left of negative 1 standard deviations, we're at negative 2 standard deviations. And if we move to the left of negative 2 standard deviations, we're at negative 3 standard deviations. So notice the mean is kind of like the balancing point or 0 standard deviations. So we have labeled our mean and our standard deviations like we had to do. Now we need to identify the value of the mean and each standard deviation. So this is where we're going to actually fill in the numbers according to the problem. So it tells us, again, right in the problem, the mean weight is 1,152 pounds. So we're able to fill that in underneath the mean, 1,152. To fill in the standard deviations, we're going to account for the standard deviation in the problem. Again, standard deviation is 84 pounds. So when we're filling in the 1 standard deviation, I want 1 standard deviation above the mean. So I'm going to add 84 to my mean, which gives me 1,236, which is the value that will fall 1 standard deviation above the mean. To find 2 standard deviations above the mean, the value, we can do this in one of 2 ways. We can start at the mean of 1,152 and add 2 standard deviations, or 2 84s. So we can add from the mean 2 84s. So we know our standard deviation, our second standard deviation, 2 standard deviations away from the mean, 1,320. Another way of finding 2 standard deviations away from the mean is adding 1 standard deviation to the 1 standard deviation score. So 1,236 plus 84. Notice either way it gets you to 1,320. All right, so to find 3 standard deviations away from the mean, again, you can do this in 2 different ways. You can add 3 standard deviations to the 1,152, or you can add 1 standard deviation to your 2 standard deviations. I like to be consistent, so I'm just going to add from my mean, 3 standard deviations. So I'm going to add 84 3 times to that mean. So my 3 standard deviation value, 1,404. To do the negative standard deviations, we're going to do a very similar process, but now we're not above the mean, we're below the mean, so we're going to subtract. So 1,152 minus a standard deviation of 84 will give us our -1 standard deviation. So our -1 standard deviation value, 1,068 pounds. Again, we're going to do a very similar process to get to the -2 standard deviations. Again, you can do this in 2 ways. You can subtract 2 standard deviations from the mean, or you can subtract 1 standard deviation from the -1 standard deviation. Again, I like to look at the actual value of the mean, so I'm going to take my value of the mean and subtract 2 standard deviations, or 2 values of 84. So my -2 standard deviation value is 984. And again, we're going to do a similar thing for my -3 standard deviations. I'm going to take away from my mean 3 standard deviations. So 3 values of 84. To get to my -3 standard deviation value of 900. So I have now drawn the normal curve. I've labeled the mean and the number of standard deviations, and I have identified the value of each mean and each standard deviation in this picture right here.